Ever wondered just what the American version of the French magazine Heavy Metal, it's not really called that, was all about? Well, so was I. So let's find out. Hello and welcome to the Friday Fantasy Show from the Bottled Imp, exploring the realms of fantasy, 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 exploring the realms of fantasy, that's what we do. My name is Ken Boyter and today we were looking at Heavy Metal. It's a Canadian-American production that was released in 1981, directed by Gerald Potterton. Now, I had no idea what this was, but I have vague memories of this poster, of this image here. So I was very curious to find out what it was. I did a little research after I watched the film, which is always a good thing, to discover that this is a heavy metal magazine that covers fantasy and sci-fi. It's American, and it's been going since 1977, and the creator of that magazine actually based it on a French magazine called Metal Howler, which I think is Metal Howling. He changed it to Heavy Metal. Anyway, let's see if it sinks or if it floats. Heavy Metal, what exactly is it all about? Well, it's actually 10 short stories. It's an anthology of science fiction fantasy. I didn't know that. I didn't know that. So you can imagine when I put it on and was quite intrigued by why the plots of each story obviously didn't make sense to me, because I was being introduced to one character and one story and then another one and another one, another one, and there was no repercussion, there was no tie-in, there was no, you know, the first character didn't then come back. Slightly confused, although they did try to string together some form of narrative to hang all these short stories together. And that was in the form of a glowing orb. Yes, it was a glowing orb about this size. It actually changes size throughout each story. And this was meant to be the sum of all evil is contained in this glowing orb. So the film opens up rather surreally, kind of reminded me of Star Wars, where you're in space and there's this space shuttle that at the time, this was the 80s, the American were launching their space shuttle. So it was very similar in design. And out of it drops a car, yes, and it looked like the Stig was driving it, and it's an open-top car that kind of just floats out into space right the way down to Earth. So you're thinking, okay, well, you know, we're in for some fun here. This is going to be quite a surreal film. And it didn't disappoint in the surrealness, if you like surreal films. So this car then lands on Earth and it gets weirder from there. So each one is connected. There's the origin story of how this orb was found by humankind. And then we discover that whoever comes in contact with this orb is corrupted. So what do we take from this film in terms of themes? There are, as I say, there's 10 short stories, and each one does try to attempt a different theme, some of which are more successful than others. The only ones I could really detect was, you know, the evils of war, the lust of mankind, you know, being cruel, and that corruption does corrupt, you know, humankind. That didn't make sense, did it? Where people's desires and lust corrupt themselves. And it also looks at big corporations and how they can be corrupted as well. And it also looks at the nature, there's one that looks at the nature of the dog-eat-dog you know, world that we can live in. So everyone's looking out for themselves. Now, this is quite an uneven film. Apparently there were several studios, animated studios, that worked on it, and you can kind of tell they've sort of done a good job of trying to make all the animations the same, but I don't know if that was their intention, because if it was, then they kind of failed, because some of them were definitely different styles of illustration than others. I would rather they would actually had really delineated, if I can say that word, delineated that situation so that you definitely know you're going into maybe a different world or a parallel universe or something to really denote that it's a different style of animation, to denote that it's going to be a different short story. Because, as I say, I was sitting there thinking, hang on, is this one story or a couple of stories? In the end, I worked it out. And I don't know if that really spoiled my enjoyment of it, but I then went, oh, okay, so once it twigged, I then kind of could sit back and relax and know what the format was. And as I say, the animations were good. It did remind me, anyone that's seen He-Man, Master of the Universe, it did remind me of that kind of style. Some of them were a little bit more cartoony than others. Others were a bit more gritty, and I kind of preferred that style. So I think maybe what I would have liked is maybe one style throughout the whole film, or several very distinct different styles, just to make it really, really clear. And the other thing that I noticed about the film is, yes, they weren't afraid of exploitation. There's loads of violence in there, nudity, there's even sex, you know, shock horror in a cartoon, and it's very adult in its themes. But it wasn't there, you know, most of it wasn't there for the justification of the story, it was just there to be there. So it did feel a little bit like, oh, okay, right. Yeah, okay, this isn't really developing any characters, this isn't moving the story along, it was just there to be there, it was just there to exploit. And it was very juvenile, you know, the attitudes towards women were a bit, oh, really? But then you have to remember when you're looking at this, yeah, this was made just after the 70s, and we all know that the 70s, well, they didn't really care about stuff like that, did they? So you know, looking back, it was one of those films where I'm glad I watched it. I was a little bit surprised by it. Some of the stories were flippant and jokey, and then you might get a really poignant and sad story that deals with, you know, the horrors of war. So it was a real kind of mismatch of emotions that some worked and some didn't. It was a little bit uneven in that respect, and I just felt that maybe there was one story in particular that was all, I think it was the First or Second World War, and it was, you know, exploring war and the horrors of war. It was about a plane and a couple of pilots, and then it takes a twist that I wasn't expecting, which was a good twist. I really just wanted to see more of that. It would have been great if they'd just done a feature film of that, because there was a lot that they could have explored with that. And, you know, because these are short stories, you only get sort of 5 or 6 minutes to explore each theme. So, yeah, I mean, it's got the voice actor of John Candy. He was the most sort of famous person I recognised, and he was good. The voice acting was good for what it needed to be. Some of the scripts were terrible. Some of them were okay. So really, it was a mixed bag. But that said, I'm all for people trying to experiment and do different things with film and books and board games. So I think it was a valid, experiment in kind of bringing short stories together. The link of this glowing orb was a little bit weak in some respects, and some of it was a little bit cheesy. But that said, there was a certain energy about the film. You could tell they were passionate about what they were doing. And the Heavy Metal magazine, is a big success in America. It's very popular. It's still going today. I think they're only doing about 6 episodes a year, 6 issues a year. But that's not bad, because obviously the internet is king really now. Print magazines and newspapers are dying down. So for something to still be going from 1977 to now is a big achievement. And I just think that they did also do a sequel, which I'm tempted to have a look at. And there is talk now that they're going to be doing another sequel, so a third one. I'm not 100% sure. Yeah, I think hopefully they'll have learnt by that, because some of the stories weren't that sophisticated, and now as storytellers, there's some fantastic HBO and dramas that are being made by Netflix and obviously the BBC that really have pushed the envelope of storytelling and sophistication. One other thing to note is obviously the musical soundtrack. There was a lot of heavy metal, as you could imagine, but it wasn't kind of out and out, really loud and obnoxious heavy metal. Sorry, heavy metal fans, I'm not a big fan of heavy metal. It's not really my music, but they wove it in really beautifully. They did a really good job with the soundtracks. And it's one of those things, again, sci-fi and rock music and fantasy and rock music, I'm not a big fan of that. But they did a good job. I wasn't too distracted by it, and they did have some incidental sort of orchestral music that was woven in as well. And there were some quite good bands in there, famous bands, Journey, Black Sabbath, the Blue Oyster Cult. You can see me reading these. And also there was even Stevie Nicks. There was even a Stevie Nicks track. So yeah, the music. So if you like that music, it's pop culture at its poppest, if I can say that. would I recommend it? Now that's an interesting one. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it to say, wow, this is an amazing film, it's going to blow your mind, it's really up there with storytelling, and no, I wouldn't say that. But if you are curious about films and about, especially obviously old films, yes, I would recommend it, because there's a lot of good ideas that are in there that it certainly takes a surreal path. So if you like that kind of thing, the surreal fantasy and sci-fi, definitely I would check this out. What I would also say is, if you are into films and it feels like it was quite an important film. And surprisingly enough for me, I was surprised by this when I looked it up. It actually did make a profit. It was made for about $3 million, and it made something like $20 million. So it was a big smash hit at the box office. So there we are. That's Heavy Metal. And I'm quite happy to say it probably did float. Yes, that's Heavy Metal. Heavy Metal, yes. One thing I will also say, the way they wrapped it all up was pretty good. It had a strong, uplifting message to it. So that was kind of good. That was good, despite all the exploitation. Anyway, that's Heavy Metal. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed that. You can check out our other reviews as well, and obviously subscribe if you haven't done so already. And remember to keep spreading the word of the Bottled Imp. Remember, keep it unreal, especially if you're listening to heavy metal music.